We're going to talk today about another nation's role in the Second World War, and that country is going to be Brazil, another nation in the Americas, and that country is going to be Brazil. You guys might see an IB exam question that asks you to talk about the role, the diplomatic or military role of two countries in the Americas during the Second World War. Don't forget the obvious one. The United States counts as a country in the Americas, unless they give you something like not including the United States. But the United States typically will count, and now you can do Brazil as well. Now we know that the United States already has a policy towards Latin America, and that policy is the good neighbor policy. And I want to say one other thing about the good neighbor policy that I might not have mentioned or mentioned very well when we first talked about it. And that's, like, it sounds so nice, doesn't it? Like Franklin Roosevelt wanting to be good guy America, good guy American president, working on good relations with our Latin American neighbors. Sounds nice, right? Not being that pushy bully America that we used to be. Franklin Roosevelt might have been a nice guy, right? Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson before might have been scoundrels. But we remember that the times that presidents are living in, the times that they're working in, are impacting the situations and how they see the situation, right? When Teddy Roosevelt is talking about speaking softly but carrying a big stick, and he's adding on his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and the United States is being more forceful and aggressive in Latin America. This is at a time where the United States is competing with other powers of the world for overseas empires, right? Whereas in the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt talks about his good neighbor policy, what's going on at that time? What? Okay, we've got aggressive powers in Europe that are starting to expand. And that's threatening to us. And what else is going on in the 1930s? We've got a Great Depression, like the worst economic downturn in American history and in the globe, around the globe. So, yeah, Franklin Roosevelt might be a nice guy. But we remember the good neighbor policy is not just about fostering better relationships with Latin America. It's fostering better relationships with Latin America in a time of economic crisis and in a time of political crisis. Teddy Roosevelt wasn't dealing with economic and political crises, right? Franklin Roosevelt is. Yes, they're cousins, right? Distant cousins. What are they? Kind of like third cousins or something? Franklin Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt. I think they're relatively distant cousins. Anyway, Roosevelt, as the United States is getting into the war, Roosevelt is going to be working hard on this guy. He's the president of Brazil. His last name is Vargas, and I learned, thanks to Breno, that his first name is Getulio. I thought it was pronounced like an H, like one would do in Spanish. But in Portuguese, it's Getulio. All right? So Getulio Vargas. Vargas, V-A-R-G-A-S. He's a big deal in Brazil. He's president of Brazil in the 1930s and 40s. And Franklin Roosevelt wants him to be a part of this war effort. He wants Vargas to be a part of this war effort. And Vargas is reluctant. Because in Latin America, Vargas has his own problems to deal with. This is not the best map of Latin America, but we're going to use it right now. Brazil is the biggest country and the most populous country in Latin America. Just to the south of Brazil is Argentina. They are natural rivals in Latin America because they're each the two largest countries in Latin America by population and land area, right? They share a common border. And Vargas is concerned that if he gets involved in this war, that it could leave them weak in their Latin American relationships with their neighbors. And this is kind of weird for the United States, or kind of maybe different for us to recognize. The United States, we only share borders with two other nations. And those borders are pretty darn safe and secure. No worries. Right. When I talk about secure, okay, Donald Trump would have differences with that. But the United States doesn't need a military force defending our border from Mexican military that might invade us, nor do we need it from Canadians, right? Whereas Brazil shares a border with almost every country in South America, I think, except for Ecuador and Chile. So they've got a lot of border defense that needs to be done. So Vargas has got to be thinking about that as well. And then there's the other issue of Brazil actually having a relationship, and a good relationship in the 1930s, with Germany. We are Brazil's biggest trading partner in the 1930s. But Germany is number 2 in growing. So Vargas doesn't necessarily want to destroy that. So as the war starts, as the United States is entering the war in December of 1941, Vargas is going to adopt, yes, sir? Well, yeah, this is not a democratic state at this point. Or not a pure democratic state, I guess we should say. He's going to purport to be. As the United States enters World War II, Vargas is happy playing what's known as the pendulum position, or what he calls the pendulum position. He'll swing whichever way he needs to swing, like a pendulum might, right? Much like the United States was doing prior to our entry in World War I. If you can sell stuff to the Germans and sell stuff to the British, good for you. But as the war progresses, Brazil is going to get dragged into it on the side of the Allies because of the way the war is being waged on the Atlantic Ocean. Now, we haven't talked yet about the Battle of the Atlantic. We will. This is one little snapshot of one small chunk of time on the Atlantic Ocean. It's in German down here, but it's March to December of 1941. And every little blue dot there represents a ship that was sunk, a merchant ship that was sunk by German U-boats. The red ones represent German U-boats that are being sunk. This is the beginning, or the early point, of what's known as the Battle of the Atlantic, where there will be literally, over the course of the war, thousands of merchant ships that will be sunk to the bottom of the ocean, killing tens or hundreds of thousands of sailors throughout the duration of the war. And as more ships are sunk, and some of these are Brazilian, the Brazilian people are going to be pushed against the Nazis, against the Germans. Much in the same way that the United States became more and more anti-German in the First World War because of U-boat activity. Hey, we have a link between the First and Second World War with U-boats. Yes, ma'am?
The Germans taking the Brazilian ships, is that like kind of an accident because they were just trying
No, this is essentially them trying to blockade supplies from getting into Britain. And so they are sinking merchant vessels that are going across the ocean to stop supplies from going into Britain. Yes, ma'am?
So is this only between Germany and Brazil?
Well, no, Germany's sinking any ships. We're going to talk in a moment. Germany's sinking Mexican ships as well. Germany's sinking American ships. Germany's sinking all kinds of ships at this point, even before we get into the war. And this is going to take Brazilian sentiment against the Germans. As this increases, Vargas is going to look towards getting involved in the war with the hope that joining the war effort and being victorious in it will increase Brazilian standing. Like, hey, if America is happy with you, and America will aid you in building up your military to fight in this war, maybe Brazil will be even in a stronger position in Latin America. That's the hope. So Brazil will enter the war on August 22nd, 1942. The United States agrees to defend the Brazilian coastline. We will take the responsibility with our Navy to defend the Brazilian coastline. And in turn, the Brazilians will let us use bases in northern Brazil. And if you notice, why would it be so important to have Brazil on Team Allies? Much closer to North Africa. So as a closer staging point to North Africa than is the coast of the United States. Brazil will also send troops into the war. Brazil will also send troops into the war. Here's an image of three men that are a part of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, BEF, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. And they actually go, about 25,000 men from Brazil are sent to Italy, where they will fight in 1944. Now, a little bit of a segue to what you guys are going to read tonight. Anything striking about this image? The black guy. Brazil, you guys may remember from AP World History a couple years ago, Brazil in its history imported more slaves from Africa than any other region of the Americas during the era of the slave trade. And they also had slavery later than it wasn't until the 1880s that Brazil outlawed slavery. By the 1940s, Brazil, with a large population of African Brazilians, has an integrated military. Blacks and whites serving together. This is at a time when the United States still has a segregated military with segregated units in our armed forces. We didn't allow whites and blacks to serve together in the United States Army in the 1940s. You guys are going to read a little bit more about this tonight. It's going to take another war for the United States and a new president for the United States to change that policy. It won't be changed until the 1950s. But that's a head scratcher, right? Within like your grandparents' lives, maybe some of your parents, but probably your grandparents' lives, the United States did not allow African Americans and whites to serve together in the same units in our military. It's kind of crazy. Everybody good? Sweet. Want to do one quick talk about Mexico. Mexico is a very similar story in the Second World War. Mexico is a very similar story. They're shipping things to Europe. Ships are being sunk by U-boats. It turns Mexican sentiment against the Germans, and the Mexicans ultimately declare war on Germany as well. They never send troops. I said Brazil is the only Latin American country that will send troops into the war.
Mexico sent like fighter pilots.
But there will be, yes, troops on the ground. But there will be some volunteer pilots from Mexico that end up in the Philippines. And here's a picture of those guys. So Mexico's story is similar. One great thing about having Mexico as an ally in the Second World War is because of their common border with the United States. When goods are going back and forth between Mexico, natural resources coming from Mexico, weapons going into Mexico, you don't have to put them on the open seas, right? You can take them right across the border. So you don't have to worry about U-boats. Everybody good?